The last morning of Anglo-Saxon England arrived without announcing itself. There was no omen visible enough to read, no sign in the sky dramatic enough to make the men on Senlac Hill understand that the world they had grown up in, the world their fathers and grandfathers had built and defended and passed down through the generations, was about to end before the sun went down. October 14th, 1066, began the way battles usually begin, with cold air and nervous stomachs, and the particular silence that falls over an army when it understands that the waiting is almost over. Harold Godwinson stood on that ridge in East Sussex with somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 men, exhausted from one of the most brutal 2-week stretches any English king had ever endured, and looked south toward an army that wanted his crown, his kingdom, and his life. He had faced worse odds before. He believed he could face them again. He was wrong, and the consequences of that era would reshape an entire civilization. To understand what was lost at Hastings, you have to understand what England was before it. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that Harold Godwinson ruled in 1066 was not a primitive backwater waiting for a more sophisticated culture to arrive and improve it. It was, by the standards of 11th century Europe, a remarkably well-organized state. It had a developed legal system, a network of royal courts, a sophisticated approach to taxation and land management, and a written bureaucratic tradition that produced documents called writs and charters that governed transactions and disputes with considerable precision. The Anglo-Saxon Church was deeply embedded in the intellectual life of Northern Europe. Monasteries produced illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty. The English language was being written down and used for literature, law, and philosophy at a time when most of continental Europe used Latin exclusively for anything serious and considered the vernacular tongues unworthy of the effort. England had a functioning mint that produced high-quality coinage. It had a system of regional governance through ealdormen and thanes that had evolved over centuries into something surprisingly effective. It was, in short, a real country with real institutions, and the people who lived there understood themselves as members of a particular culture with a particular history. That culture had deep roots. The Anglo-Saxons had been in England since the collapse of Roman Britain in the 5th century. Germanic settlers who had crossed the North Sea and slowly built kingdoms out of the post-Roman chaos. Over centuries, those kingdoms had consolidated, warred with each other, been invaded by Vikings, made peace with Vikings, sometimes been ruled by Vikings, and eventually emerged as a unified English kingdom under the West Saxon kings of the 9th and 10th centuries. Alfred the Great had saved Wessex from complete Viking conquest by a combination of military resilience and political intelligence that made him the most admired figure in English history. Before the Norman period began the process of making English history look like it started in 1066, his descendants had built on that foundation. Athelstan had become the first king to rule all of England. Edgar the Peaceful had presided over a period of relative stability. The Viking king Nut had ruled England competently enough that his reign looked in retrospect less like a conquest than a merger. England had survived a great deal. Its people had a certain confidence built from that survival, a sense that whatever came at them, they would endure and adapt and continue. Harold Godwinson was the product of that tradition. He was not of royal blood himself, a fact that his enemies never let him forget, and that the Duke of Normandy would use as a central justification for his invasion. Harold was the son of Godwin of Wessex, the most powerful earl in England, a man who had accumulated enough landed wealth and political influence to be genuinely dangerous to kings. Harold had inherited that position and that power, and had spent years demonstrating that he possessed the military and political skills to justify his prominence. He had fought campaigns in Wales with considerable success, using tactics that were flexible and practical rather than rigidly traditional. He had navigated the treacherous politics of the English court through the reigns of multiple kings. He was, by most assessments, exactly the kind of man England needed on its throne, at a moment when threats were multiplying. The year 1066 had begun with threats so numerous they barely seemed real. Edward the Confessor, the king who had ruled England since 1042, died in January without a direct heir, which was precisely the kind of dynastic vacuum that medieval politics were designed to make dangerous. Harold had himself crowned almost immediately, with the apparent support of the English nobility and the approval of the Retribution, the council of leading men who had the authority to elect kings in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. The speed of the coronation suggested both genuine popular support and a keen awareness that hesitation would invite exactly the chaos that followed anyway. 3 men believed they had a claim to the English throne. One of them was Harold Hardrada of Norway, who based his claim on an agreement between earlier Scandinavian kings that the English crown would pass to the Norwegian line if certain conditions were met. The legal basis was questionable, but the military basis was considerable. Hardrada was arguably the most feared warrior in Europe at the time, a veteran of campaigns across the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean, who had spent decades collecting victories and a reputation for ferocity that preceded him everywhere he went. The second claimant was William, Duke of Normandy, who based his claim on a personal promise he said had been made to him by Edward the Confessor during a visit to the Norman court in 1051. And further on, an oath he claimed Harold himself had sworn on holy relics to support William's succession. The oath story was central to William's entire political and moral justification for the invasion. If Harold had sworn such an oath and then broken it by accepting the crown himself, then Harold was a perjurer and a usurper, and William was a righteous man reclaiming what God and law had promised him. Whether the oath was sworn, and if sworn, whether it was freely given or extracted under duress during a period when Harold was essentially William's prisoner in Normandy, is something the sources disagree on in ways that cannot be resolved. William believed, or at least convincingly performed believing, that he was in the right. He had spent months assembling an invasion fleet and an army drawn from Normandy and from knights across northern France who were attracted by the prospect of land and wealth in a country they were about to help conquer. Harold spent the summer of 1066 waiting on the southern coast of England for William's invasion, with a fleet and an army positioned to meet it. The invasion did not come on schedule. William was held back by unfavorable winds through the summer, and Harold's army, relying on systems of food supply that were not designed for indefinite campaigning, began to strain. In September, Harold made the decision to stand down the fleet and allow his forces to disperse. It was a reasonable decision given the information available and the logistical reality. It was also, in retrospect, catastrophic in its timing. On September 18th, news reached Harold in London that Harold Hardrada had invaded from the north. The Norwegian king had sailed up the Humber with a fleet of several hundred ships and an army that combined his own Norwegian forces with English rebels, including Harold's own brother Tostig, who had been exiled and had never forgiven it. Hardrada had met the English northern earls at the Battle of Fulford Gate on September 20th and destroyed them. The north of England was open. York had submitted. Hardrada was encamped at Stamford Bridge, waiting for hostages that would formalize the surrender of the region. Harold's response was one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval English history. He assembled his household troops, his huscarls, the professional warriors who formed the core of any Anglo-Saxon army, and moved north at a pace that defied the normal assumptions about how quickly medieval armies traveled. He covered roughly 200 miles in approximately 4 days, picking up additional forces as he went. On the morning of September 25th, his army appeared at Stamford Bridge so unexpectedly that many of the Norwegian warriors were on the wrong side of the river without their armor. having left it in camp on a warm day when no attack seemed possible. The battle that followed was a decisive English victory. Harold Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army was shattered so completely that the survivors needed only a fraction of the ships they had arrived in to carry the remnants home. It was a stunning military achievement, the kind of victory that, under different circumstances, would have defined a reign and secured a legend. 3 days later, on September 28th, William of Normandy landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast with his army. Harold received the news while still in Yorkshire, celebrating the victory at Stamford Bridge. What happened next has been argued about by historians ever since. Harold moved south again at remarkable speed, assembled his army at London, and was at Senlac Hill near Hastings by the evening of October 13th, less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge. His advisors, including his brother Gurth, reportedly urged him to rest and consolidate, to gather more forces, to wait and let William's army exhaust itself foraging in the countryside. Harold refused. Whether this was the confident aggression of a man who had just destroyed one invasion and believed he could destroy another, or a catastrophic failure to recognize that the situation was fundamentally different, or simply a king's determination to defend his kingdom from a foreign invader without giving that invader more time to entrench and recruit, no source can tell us with certainty. Harold was there at Hastings on the morning of October 14th with a tired army and the knowledge that Duke William was coming. William's army was a different kind of force from the one Harold had beaten at Stamford Bridge. The Norman military system was built around cavalry, armored knights fighting on horseback who used the momentum and height of their mounts as weapons. Continental European warfare had increasingly centered on this model for a generation, and the Normans had refined it to a particularly effective degree. William also had archers, organized infantry, and the organizational capacity to coordinate these different elements of his force in ways that the Anglo-Saxon system struggled to match. Harold's army was built around the Huscarls and the Fyrd, the professional warriors and the levied infantry who formed up in the traditional shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, presenting a barrier that was extraordinarily resistant to frontal assault, but that had real vulnerabilities on its flanks and to missile weapons. The English position on Senlac Hill was well chosen. The slope gave them a defensive advantage, as any attacking force would have to fight uphill. The ground at the base of the hill was wet and uneven in places, which would complicate cavalry operations. Harold anchored his flanks on marshy ground where possible. His plan, if it can be reconstructed from the sources, appears to have been to hold the hill, absorb Norman attacks, and wait for the attacking force to exhaust itself against the shield wall, at which point the English could counterattack. It was not an unreasonable plan. The shield wall had worked against Viking opponents for generations. Harold had used it himself. William advanced his army in the morning, organizing his forces into 3 divisions, roughly corresponding to the Normans at the center and his French and Flemish allies on the flanks. In front of the heavy infantry came the archers, and the battle opened with the longbows doing what archers always did at the start of medieval engagements, sending arrows into the enemy formation to disrupt it and kill men before the lines closed. The English shield wall held, shields were raised, men were hit but the line did not break. The archers advanced, which was normal procedure when their initial volleys at longer range had not produced a collapse, but the angle created a problem that would recur throughout the day. Shooting uphill at a wall of overlapping shields meant that arrows either hit the shields or flew over the formation. The English were relatively well protected by both the angle and the shields themselves. The initial archery phase produced casualties, but not the chaos that archers hoped to produce before an infantry advance. The Norman infantry came next, moving uphill toward the English line. The fighting that followed was exactly the kind of brutal, close-quarters attrition that shield wall combat always was. axes, swords, spears, used in the compressed space between two lines of men trying to kill each other. The English had the advantage of higher ground. The Normans had the advantage of fresher legs, since Harold's men had been marching and fighting for weeks. Neither advantage was conclusive. The lines ground against each other for what the sources describe as hours, the kind of time frame that suggests the outcome was genuinely uncertain and that neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Men were dying on both sides. The hill ran with blood in the way that the chroniclers always described, and which, for all their tendency toward exaggeration, was literally accurate in ways modern readers sometimes prefer not to imagine. The Norman cavalry, who should have been the decisive element, found the hill and the shield wall resistant in ways that may have surprised William. Horses do not naturally charge into a wall of shields and spears. They can be trained to tolerate a great deal, but a solid line of men presenting sharp points tends to produce a reaction in horses that no amount of training fully overcomes. The Norman cavalry hit the English line, struck at it, tried to find gaps, and largely failed to break through. The left wing of William's army, the Breton division, began to fall back. This happened early enough in the battle that some historians believe it was genuine flight, rather than a tactical maneuver. The Bretons were not Normans, and their commitment to William's cause was primarily financial rather than patriotic. Whatever the cause, they broke and began moving downhill in some disorder. Here, the battle turned on a decision that was either the worst mistake Harold's army made or an entirely understandable human response to apparent victory. Portions of the English right wing broke formation and pursued the fleeing Bretons downhill. The reasons are debated endlessly. Some historians argue it was undisciplined furred levies, farmers and tradesmen acting on instinct rather than training, breaking ranks to chase a fleeing enemy. Others argue it was a deliberate decision by some commanders who saw an opportunity to destroy a retreating force before it could reform. Whatever the reason, men left the ridge and went downhill, and that changed everything. The Normans, whether reacting to the opportunity or executing a plan they had prepared for exactly this possibility, turned their cavalry on the men now isolated in the open ground below the hill. The English who had pursued were cut down. The right wing of the English position had been stripped of men. The gap was not immediately fatal, but it was real, and William understood its significance immediately. Later in the battle, the same thing happened again. Whether the Normans deliberately performed a feigned retreat, a maneuver of considerable tactical sophistication that required precise coordination and nerves of steel from the men doing the retreating, has been argued since the battle was fought. The sources, most of them Norman and therefore not entirely neutral, claim that William ordered deliberate feigned retreats multiple times during the day, and that they worked each time. Modern military historians have debated whether such a maneuver was realistic, given the chaos of medieval combat. But the fact that the same result, English pursuit followed by cavalry encirclement, seems to have occurred repeatedly during the battle suggests either genuine tactical sophistication on William's part, or a recurring pattern of English commanders making the same error under pressure. Either interpretation is damaging to Harold's army. The English position had been degraded by the afternoon. The shield wall was still standing, but it was shorter than it had been in the morning. The casualties accumulated over hours of fighting, and the men lost in the pursuit episodes, having reduced the numbers that Harold could put in the line. The flanks were more exposed. The archers, who had struggled to do damage in the morning due to the angle, may have adjusted their approach as the afternoon wore on, shooting higher to drop arrows in a plunging arc onto the men behind the front line of the wall, rather than trying to punch through the shields directly. The sources, and Shakespeare and later artists, have made much of the arrow that struck Harold in the eye, the famous image from the Bayeux Tapestry. Whether that tapestry image actually depicts Harold's death rather than a different moment is contested by historians. Whether Harold was killed by an arrow at all, rather than by Norman cavalry who broke through and cut him down, is also uncertain. What is clear is that Harold died that afternoon, somewhere on the ridge, and that when he died, the battle was effectively over. The death of a king in medieval battle was not merely the loss of a commander. It was a symbolic and political event of the First Order. An army fighting for a king who is still alive, knows what it is fighting for, and can make rational calculations about continuing the fight. An army whose king has just died faces a different question, one that has no clean military answer. Who now orders the advance or the retreat? Who holds the obligation of loyalty? The English huscarls, Harold's professional warriors, had sworn oaths to Harold personally, and those oaths did not automatically transfer to anyone else in the immediate chaos of a battlefield. Some of them fought on around Harold's body with the commitment of men who had decided that dying beside their lord was preferable to surviving him. The sources describe them holding their ground until the last man. Is the kind of end that tends to produce legends. The rear guard that refuses to break, the men who understood that the world had ended and chose not to outlive it. The feared, the wider levied force, broke and fled. Norman cavalry pursued them into the gathering dark of an October evening, killing the fleeing men in the open ground south of the ridge. The English losses were heavy, but not total. Many escaped. Many would fight again in the resistance movements that continued for years after the conquest. But the battle was over. William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy, had killed the King of England and held the field. By any standard of medieval law and practice, the kingdom was now his. What followed was not a smooth or immediate transfer of power. England did not simply open its gates and welcome its new ruler with gratitude for the improvement. There were other English claimants. Edgar Atheling, a boy of around 14 with a genuine claim based on royal blood, was put forward by the remaining English nobility as king. The northern earls, who had not been at Hastings and whose armies were intact, appeared to be preparing resistance. William moved carefully but decisively, sweeping through southeast England, demonstrating military force and accepting submissions, burning villages that refused to cooperate in a manner calculated to make the cost of resistance clear to anyone watching. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066 in a ceremony that went almost immediately wrong when the Norman guards outside, hearing the shouts of acclamation from inside the church, mistook them for sounds of violence and set fire to buildings in the surrounding area, which created enough chaos that the congregation fled in panic, and the coronation concluded in a nearly empty church with Harold's former archbishop administering the rites to a king whose hands may have been visibly shaking. It was not an auspicious beginning, and William knew it. The years that followed the conquest were, for the English, a catastrophe on a scale that had no real precedent in their history. William's approach to consolidating power involved the systematic dispossession of the English landowning class, the Thegns and Earls, whose wealth and position formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon society. English land was given to Norman knights and lords who had supported the invasion. This was not a gradual process or an occasional exception. By the time the Domesday Book was compiled in 1086, the survey of English landholding that William commissioned in the last years of his reign, the transfer of wealth and land from English to Norman hands was so complete that English landowners holding significant territory directly from the crown could be counted almost on one hand. An entire class, the people who had run England for centuries, had been essentially erased from the top of their own society, replaced by men who spoke a different language, worshipped in a church that used different architectural forms, and regarded the people they now governed with a mixture of contempt and wariness. The English language itself was nearly pushed underground. Norman French became the language of government, of law, of literature, Of the church at its highest levels, of polite society and political power, English continued to be spoken by the vast majority of the population because you cannot simply order millions of people to stop speaking their native tongue. But for roughly 2 centuries, it was the language of the conquered, the tongue of peasants, and the lower orders, not considered worthy of serious written literature or official documentation. The transformation of the English language that occurred over the following 3 centuries, the emergence of Middle English as a fusion of Anglo-Saxon roots and Norman French vocabulary, was the linguistic legacy of Hastings, the point at which the conqueror's tongue began to merge with the conquered's until something new emerged that was neither one nor the other. The English spoken today carries that history inside it in ways that most speakers never notice. A king reigns, but a peasant works. Beef is served at the Norman lord's table, but the Anglo-Saxon farmer raises a cow. Pork arrives at the feast, but the farmer tends pigs. The split between the French-derived words for food as consumed and the Germanic words for animals as raised reflects exactly the social structure of post-conquest England, a Norman-speaking ruling class eating what an English-speaking working class raised. The physical landscape of England was transformed as visibly as its social structure. The Normans built in stone with a confidence and ambition that the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which worked largely in wood, had never attempted at the same scale. Castles went up across England with startling speed, the motte and bailey fortresses of the early conquest years giving way to the great stone keeps that still stand, or whose ruins still stand, from the White Tower in London to the castle at Rochester to Colchester to dozens of sites across the country. These were not merely defensive structures, they were statements visible from miles away of who now held power and what the cost of challenging that power would be. The churches and cathedrals that the Normans built, the great Romanesque structures at Durham and Ely and Winchester, were equally deliberate expressions of authority. Architecture used as politics, stone saying what armies had already said with blades. The English church was remade almost as thoroughly as English landholding. Norman bishops replaced English ones. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself, Stigand, who had crowned Harold, was deposed and replaced by Lanfranc of Bec, an Italian-born scholar who was William's trusted churchman and who set about reforming the English church along Norman and continental lines with considerable thoroughness. The monastery at Ely, which had been a center of English resistance, led by a figure known as Hereward the Wake, was suppressed. English saints, the local holy figures whose cults formed part of the texture of Anglo-Saxon religious life, were examined skeptically by Norman churchmen who were not always convinced that the English had been rigorous enough in their approach to sanctity. The story goes that Lanfranc asked Archbishop Wulfstan of Worcester how he could be so confident that the Anglo-Saxon saints he venerated were genuinely holy, and Wulfstan, who was one of the very few English bishops to retain his position after the conquest, replied that he knew it from miracles. The exchange captures the tension between two religious cultures that nominally worshiped the same God but brought very different assumptions to the task. The resistance to the conquest was real and lasted longer than the simple narrative of a single decisive battle suggests. In 1069, a Danish fleet arrived in England and coordinated with northern English rebels to produce a rebellion that briefly recaptured York and threatened to unravel everything William had built. William's response was the event known as the Harrying of the North, a systematic campaign of destruction through Yorkshire and the surrounding regions, so thorough and deliberate that contemporaries described it with undisguised horror. Crops were burned, livestock was killed, settlements were destroyed. The Domesday Book, compiled 17 years later, still recorded enormous swaths of Yorkshire as waste land that was generating no revenue because there was no one left to work it and no infrastructure left to support anyone who might try. The death toll from the famine and cold that followed the destruction was described by one chronicler in terms that suggest something approaching a regional catastrophe. William was not squeamish about the methods required to hold what he had taken. He was, by the standards of his age, and even somewhat beyond them, ruthless, and he would have considered that a description rather than a criticism. Hereward, the Wake is the most famous face of English resistance, and like most famous faces of resistance, he is half legend and difficult to see clearly behind the stories. He operated in the fenlands of East Anglia, using the marshes and waterways as cover in ways that made him effectively impossible to catch through conventional military operations. He held out until at least 1071, when William's forces captured the Isle of Ely that had served as his base. What happened to Hereward afterward is uncertain. Some sources say he made his peace with William. Others suggest he continued fighting and died in obscure circumstances. He became, in later centuries, a symbol of English defiance, the man who refused to submit, and that role grew larger over time as England processed what had been done to it, and needed heroes who had said no to the Normans with whatever weapons were available. The question of what Hastings actually meant in the long term is one that historians have never stopped arguing about, because it cuts to the heart of questions about continuity and rupture in history that have no clean resolution. One school of thought argues that the Norman Conquest was a genuine discontinuity, a shattering of one civilization and its replacement by another, the most complete transformation that English society experienced in the historical period. Another argues that the continuities were stronger than the ruptures, that Anglo-Saxon institutions survived in modified form, that the English common law tradition, which would eventually become one of England's most significant contributions to political civilization, drew on pre-conquest roots as much as Norman innovations, that the English people and English culture persisted beneath the surface of Norman lordship and eventually absorbed their conquerors rather than simply submitting to them. Both schools of thought have evidence on their side, which is usually how genuine historical arguments work. The disruption was real. The dispossession of the English landowning class was real. The linguistic transformation was real. The architectural and ecclesiastical revolution was real. These were not superficial changes. They went to the foundations of how English society was organized and how English people understood themselves and their place in the world. At the same time, the administrative structures that William found useful, the taxation systems, the local court networks, the written legal traditions, were preserved and built upon. The English language survived, transformed, but alive. The English people survived, diminished and oppressed, but continuous. The country that emerged from the conquest was neither purely Norman nor purely Anglo-Saxon. It was something new, shaped by the collision, carrying the marks of both the thing that had been broken and the force that had broken it. William himself died in 1087 from injuries sustained during a military campaign in France, which was where he spent most of his time after 1072, and which remained in some deep sense his real home. He had never learned English with any fluency. He had taken a kingdom, reorganized it, exploited it, defended it, and bequeathed it to sons who would fight each other over it. On his deathbed, by the accounts that survive, he expressed regret for the suffering he had caused the English. Whether that regret was genuine or a deathbed performance, and whether it mattered to the English who had suffered regardless of how he felt about it, is not a question the sources can answer. He was buried in Normandy. England had been his greatest achievement and his most profitable possession. It had never been his home. What Harold might have made of England, had the arrow missed or the cavalry charge come a moment later, or the shield wall held for another hour, is the great unanswerable question of English history. He was a capable king and a proven general, and the England he ruled had real strengths and a genuine future under competent management. The Viking threat from Scandinavia which had dominated English politics for nearly a century, had effectively ended at Stamford Bridge. Harold's victory there had not only killed Hardrada, but had broken the credibility of Scandinavian claims on England so completely that they never seriously materialized again. And England, under Harold, might have developed along very different lines from the one that actually emerged, retaining stronger connections to the Scandinavian world, developing its vernacular literary tradition without the interruption that the conquest imposed, building its legal and administrative institutions from Anglo-Saxon rather than Norman foundations. It would have been a different country. Whether better or worse in any meaningful sense is not a question that has an answer. It would simply have been different, shaped by different hands and different choices and a different morning. But Harold died on Senlac Hill, and the England that might have been died with him, the England that actually existed, the England of Norman castles and French-speaking lords and Latin church records and dispossessed English thanes, was built on his grave and on the graves of the men who stood beside him on that ridge and chose not to run. Their descendants, the English people who survived the conquest and the harrying and the decades of Norman rule that followed, adapted and endured in the way that people always do, learning when to submit and when to resist, preserving what could be preserved and abandoning what could not. By the 13th century, something recognizably English was beginning to reassert itself, the English language returning to literary prestige, English legal traditions reasserting themselves against Norman innovations, English political culture producing Magna Carta and eventually Parliament in ways that neither the Norman conquerors nor the Anglo-Saxon predecessors would have entirely predicted. The Battle of Hastings lasted, by most estimates, from approximately 9 in the morning until dusk, somewhere between 8 and 10 hours of continuous fighting on a hill in Sussex. In those hours the English king died. The English noble class was effectively sentenced to dispossession. The English language was relegated to the margins of power for 2 centuries. The physical landscape of England was committed to transformation, and the history of what would eventually become one of the most influential countries in human history was diverted into channels that shaped everything downstream of it. The empire that England eventually built, the language that English eventually became, the legal and political institutions that English-speaking countries eventually spread around the world, all of them carry the marks of that October afternoon, the traces of a collision between 2 versions of what England could have been. One of them won. The other became the ghost that haunts the winner, the question underneath every answer, the country that was and was not and might have been, present in the bones of the language and the ruins of the great Norman castles that still stand against English skies, staring back across 1,000 years of everything that followed, the day the last Anglo-Saxon king fell at Hastings, and the world that made him fell with him.